In a quiet public park, young Officer Brett Calloway aggressively confronts an older black woman, Diane Foster, for feeding pigeons on a bench, accusing her of loitering and demanding identification in front of gathering onlookers. We go back to Diane's morning routine at home, revealing she spent 32 years rising through the ranks of the city police department before retiring as chief, and she still keeps her late husband's badge, a fellow officer who died in the line of duty. The park is introduced in cinematic detail, a peaceful morning gathering spot for retirees, joggers, and families, with a nearby police substation and a growing crowd of witnesses as the confrontation escalates. Officer Calloway demands Diane's ID for simply sitting on a bench feeding birds, dismissing her calm explanations and treating her as suspicious despite having done nothing wrong. Flashback beats reveal Calloway has a pattern of racially profiling residents in this neighborhood, with complaints buried by a captain who happens to be his uncle. A young rookie officer named Sarah, partnered with Calloway that morning, quietly grows uncomfortable and hints she has seen this behavior before and tried reporting it. Calloway escalates, handcuffing Diane and calling for backup, claiming she resisted a lawful order, despite her calm compliance and clear dignity throughout. We learn Sarah's body camera captured the entire interaction, and that Diane's old service record, badge number, and community reputation are about to surface through a dispatcher who recognizes her name on the radio. The city's current police chief, informed of the situation by dispatch, arrives personally at the park alongside internal affairs, and the gathered crowd falls silent as his cruiser pulls up. The chief reveals that Diane Foster is his own former mentor and predecessor, the woman who once ran this department for over a decade, backed by her badge, service record, and Sarah's body camera footage showing the unlawful stop. Calloway's excuses collapse under the weight of the footage and Diane's record. His uncle's protection unravels, and he faces suspension, investigation, and public accountability. Months later, Diane is honored by the department. New bias training is implemented. Sarah is promoted for her integrity, and the story closes with an emotional message and YouTube call to action. "Ma'am, I need to see some ID, and I need it right now." The words cracked through the quiet morning air of Fairview Park, sharp and demanding, cutting straight through the gentle coo of pigeons gathering near a wooden bench. Officer Brett Calloway stood over a 63-year-old black woman in a soft gray cardigan, one hand resting on his belt, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed without question. Diane Foster looked up slowly from the small bag of birdseed in her lap, her expression calm, though something steady and unreadable settled behind her eyes. "Good morning, officer," she said evenly. "I'm just feeding the birds. I come here most mornings." "This is a public park, not your personal bird sanctuary," Calloway said, loud enough that a jogger slowed her pace nearby, and an older man walking his dog paused to watch. "We've had reports of loitering in this area. I need identification." A few onlookers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, the way people often do when a uniform is involved and the situation feels too uncertain to interrupt. Diane reached slowly and deliberately into her purse, producing her driver's license without a hint of panic in her movements, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've lived 3 blocks from this park for over 20 years, she said quietly, handing it over. "I've never once been asked for identification for sitting on a bench." "Well, maybe it's time someone started asking," Calloway said, glancing at the license with barely concealed disinterest before handing it back. "People like you tend to think rules don't apply to them." The words landed heavy in the morning air. A young rookie officer standing a few feet behind Calloway shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking nervously toward her partner, though she said nothing. Diane simply folded her hands in her lap, calm and dignified despite the insult, watching Calloway with the quiet patience of someone who had faced far worse in her lifetime and had learned, long ago, exactly how to hold her composure. He had no idea who he had just stopped, or how completely this ordinary morning was about to unravel everything he thought he understood about his own authority. 2 hours earlier, in a modest brick house on a tree-lined street not far from Fairview Park, Diane Foster had woken at dawn, just as she had for most of her adult life. She moved through her kitchen with the quiet efficiency of 32 years of early mornings, making coffee, setting out a small bag of birdseed by the door, and pausing, as she often did, in front of a small glass display case mounted on her hallway wall. Inside sat two badges side by side. Her own, retired now after a career that had taken her from beat officer to the city's first black female police chief, and beside it, her late husband Marcus's badge, a fellow officer who had died in the line of duty 17 years earlier, responding to a call that should have taken 10 minutes and instead took everything from her. She touched the glass gently every morning before leaving the house, a small private ritual that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with gratitude, for the years they'd shared, for the career she'd built in his memory as much as her own, and for the quiet, unassuming life she had chosen to live since retiring 3 years earlier. Diane had spent her 32 years in law enforcement fighting, often quietly and from within, against exactly the kind of behavior she was about to encounter that morning. She had built entire training programs around de-escalation and bias awareness, had personally mentored dozens of young officers, including the current chief of police, who had once been a nervous rookie under her command decades earlier. She kept a small notebook in her desk drawer, too, filled with handwritten notes from her years as chief, reminders to herself about the officers she'd mentored, the reforms she'd fought to implement, the small victories that never made headlines but had, in her mind, mattered more than any commendation ever could. She had always believed that real change happened quietly, one relationship and one policy at a time, long before it ever became something news camera noticed. These days, her mornings were simpler: a walk to the park, a bag of birdseed, a bench beneath an old oak tree where she could sit quietly and watch a city she had spent her whole career trying to protect, no longer carrying a badge, no longer needing one to feel like she belonged there. She had no idea, locking her front door that morning with her badge still resting safely in its case at home, that in less than 2 hours, a young officer barely a third of her age would decide she looked suspicious simply for existing quietly in a place she had every right to be. Fairview Park sat at the center of a quiet residential neighborhood, its winding paths shaded by old oak trees, its wide green lawns dotted most mornings with joggers, dog walkers, and retirees enjoying the early hours before the day's heat set in. A small police substation stood just 2 blocks away, close enough that patrol officers frequently walked or drove through the park during their morning rounds. The park had long been considered one of the neighborhood's quiet treasures, a gathering place for elderly residents who met daily on the same benches, young parents pushing strollers along the paved loop, and a community garden tended by volunteers near the eastern edge. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where a missed morning from a regular visitor would prompt gentle concern rather than indifference. That morning, as Diane settled onto her usual bench beneath the oldest oak tree in the park, a small crowd had begun to gather nearby for the neighborhood's weekly outdoor yoga class, along with the regular mix of dog walkers and joggers moving along the looping path. It was, by every measure, an ordinary, peaceful morning. Officer Calloway and his rookie partner, Sarah Nguyen, had been assigned to patrol the area following a handful of vague complaints from a single anonymous resident about suspicious loitering near the park's benches, complaints that notably had only ever been filed about elderly black residents who frequented the park regularly, though no one in the department had connected that pattern until much later. It was into this peaceful, ordinary scene that Calloway's cruiser rolled to a stop, and within minutes, the quiet morning gathering would become something the entire neighborhood remembered for years to come. She had no idea how quickly this gentle, familiar place was about to become the site of a confrontation loud enough to draw an entire crowd. The confrontation had escalated the moment Diane calmly, but firmly pushed back against Calloway's demand. "Officer, I've answered your question," she said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "I've shown you my identification. Is there anything else you need? Or may I continue feeding the birds?" "What I need," Calloway said, stepping closer, "is for you to understand that when an officer asks you a question, you answer it with respect, not attitude." "I haven't given you any attitude," Diane replied evenly. I've simply asked a reasonable question." A small crowd had begun to form now, drawn by the raised voices, the yoga instructor pausing mid-stretch, a mother quietly pulling her stroller back a few extra feet, an elderly man who recognized Diane from the neighborhood, watching with visible concern, but saying nothing, unwilling to insert himself into a confrontation with an armed officer. "You know what?" Calloway said, his tone hardening further. "I think you need to stand up. We're going to have a longer conversation about your presence in this park." Diane rose slowly, deliberately, her movements calm and unhurried, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be searching for. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 2 decades, officer. I have every right to sit on this bench." "That's not for you to decide," Calloway snapped. What Calloway didn't notice, caught up in his own escalating irritation, was that his rookie partner, Sarah, had gone very still beside him, her hand resting near her own body camera, her expression tightening with something that looked distinctly like discomfort rather than agreement. That small detail, a rookie's growing unease near the edge of the scene, will become the first crack in Officer Calloway's entire morning. This was not the first time Officer Calloway had treated a resident of this neighborhood this way, and it would not have been the last had the wrong person not happened to be sitting on that particular bench. 4 months earlier, an elderly black man named Robert Ellison had been stopped while walking home from the corner store, questioned aggressively about a grocery bag Calloway claimed looked suspicious, and held for nearly 20 minutes before being released without any citation or explanation. 2 months before that, a black teenager named Marcus Webb, no relation to Diane's late husband, though the coincidence had never occurred to anyone at the department, had been stopped 3 times in a single month while simply walking to and from his part-time job, each stop logged under vague justifications that never quite matched department policy. And just 6 weeks ago, a black woman jogging through the same park at dawn had been pulled over near the entrance and questioned about whether the expensive running shoes she wore were actually hers. Each of these incidents had generated a formal complaint. Each complaint had landed on the desk of Captain Roy Hensley, the precinct's commanding officer, and as few people outside the department knew, Officer Calloway's uncle. Each complaint had been quietly closed within days, citing insufficient evidence or officer discretion within policy, despite body camera footage that, had anyone bothered to review it carefully, told a very different story. Each of these residents had walked away from their encounter with Calloway, believing there was little point in pushing back further, assuming the system simply worked this way and always would. None of them knew that the same officer, patrolling the same handful of blocks, had built an entire pattern of behavior that his own family connection had quietly shielded from consequence. A precinct doesn't announce when favoritism has quietly protected one of its own for years. It simply keeps operating, complaint after complaint, until someone with enough standing and enough proof finally forces the pattern into the light. Diane Foster, standing calmly in front of Officer Calloway with her identification still in hand, was about to become exactly that kind of reckoning. Sarah Nguyen had been a police officer for exactly 7 months, still finding her footing in a department that felt, at times, far more complicated than her academy training had prepared her for. She had noticed the pattern in Calloway's stops almost immediately after being partnered with him 3 months earlier. The way his tone shifted depending on who he was addressing, the way certain neighborhoods received far more scrutiny than others, the way his uncle's name seemed to make complaints simply disappear. She had tried reporting her concerns once, quietly, to a sergeant she trusted, only to be told, gently but firmly, that she was still learning how things worked and should focus on building relationships with her training officer rather than second-guessing his judgment. Standing now at the edge of this escalating confrontation, watching Calloway's irritation build towards something she recognized as dangerous, Sarah made a small, quiet decision that would matter more than she yet realized. She reached up and confirmed, with a subtle press of her fingers, that her body camera was recording clearly. "Brett," she said quietly, stepping slightly closer to her partner, "maybe we should just let her go. She's cooperating." "She's not cooperating," Calloway said sharply, not even glancing at her. "She's testing me." Sarah didn't argue further, understanding, from 3 months of careful observation, exactly how quickly disagreement could turn into retaliation within this particular partnership. But she kept her body camera angled carefully toward the unfolding scene, and quietly, without drawing attention to herself, sent a brief text message to a number saved simply as Chief's Office tip line. She didn't know it yet, but in less than 20 minutes, that quiet decision was going to matter more than anything else that happened in Fairview Park that morning. Calloway's patience, thin from the start, finally snapped completely. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he said, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're being detained for failure to comply with a lawful order." A gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The yoga instructor stopped entirely, phone rising instinctively to record. The elderly man who recognized Diane stepped forward slightly, his voice trembling as he called out, "She hasn't done anything. I've known this woman for years." Diane did not resist. She turned calmly, placing her hands behind her back with the same measured composure she had carried through the entire encounter. Though something in her eyes had shifted now. Not fear, but the sharp, focused clarity of someone who understood exactly how serious this moment had become. "You are making a very serious mistake, officer," she said quietly as the cuffs clicked into place. "I'd advise you to call for a supervisor before this goes any further." "I don't need advice from you," Calloway snapped, keying his radio to request backup, his voice tight with adrenaline and a stubborn refusal to back down in front of the growing crowd. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her body camera still recording every second of the interaction, watching her training officer handcuff a calm, compliant 63-year-old woman over what had begun as a simple request for identification. But Calloway had no idea that Sarah's earlier text message had already reached someone with far more authority than a precinct sergeant. He had no idea that the dispatcher fielding his backup request was about to recognize a name on the radio that would change everything. The call had already been made, and it was about to reach someone who understood exactly who Diane Foster really was. What Officer Calloway did not know, what almost no one gathered in Fairview Park that morning knew, was at the moment Sarah's radio call for backup crackled through dispatch, a longtime dispatcher named Carol Jennings had frozen at her station. "Requesting backup at Fairview Park," the radio call had stated. "Subject Diane Foster, refusing to comply, currently detained." Carol had worked dispatch for the department for 19 years. She had spoken Diane Foster's name into her radio 1,000 times over the decades, back when Diane had been a young sergeant working night patrol, and later, with growing pride, when Diane had become the department's first black female chief. Carol had personally coordinated dispatch logistics for Diane's retirement ceremony just 3 years earlier, an event attended by the mayor, the current chief, and nearly the entire department. Carol's hands trembled slightly as she immediately flagged the call to internal affairs, then placed a direct line to the office of the current chief of police, a man named David Whitmore. The very same nervous rookie Diane had personally mentored 22 years earlier, back when he'd been unsure whether he belonged in law enforcement at all. Carol's hands trembled slightly as she immediately flagged the call to internal affairs, then placed a direct line to the office of the current chief of police, a man named David Whitmore. The very same nervous rookie Diane had personally mentored 22 years earlier, back when he'd been unsure whether he belonged in law enforcement at all. She remembered, even now, the exact words Diane had once used to calm a room full of frightened new recruits after a difficult night shift. "This badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you responsible for everyone." Carol had never forgotten that line, and she suspected David hadn't either. "Chief," Carol said, her voice tight with urgency, "Officer Calloway has Diane Foster detained at Fairview Park. I thought you'd want to know immediately." David Whitmore did not hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, informed his internal affairs liaison to meet him at the scene, and was in his vehicle within 90 seconds, his mind racing through 2 decades of memories. Diane's steady voice guiding him through his first difficult arrest, her office door always open when he doubted himself, the quiet dignity she had modeled for an entire generation of officers under her command. The truth about who Diane Foster really was had been sitting quietly in a department archive for years, waiting for exactly this moment to matter. The police cruiser that pulled up to Fairview Park moments later arrived with none of Calloway's earlier bravado. No lights, no sirens, simply a quiet, controlled urgency that immediately shifted the energy of the gathered crowd. Chief David Whitmore stepped out, his expression tight with barely controlled alarm, followed closely by an internal affairs investigator carrying a tablet. He crossed the grass in quick, purposeful strides, his eyes locking immediately on the sight of Diane Foster, standing handcuffed near the park bench, calm and composed despite everything. Calloway, seeing his chief's uniform approach, straightened instinctively, his earlier confidence flickering into uncertain confusion. "Chief, I got a subject here who refused to. Take those cuffs off her right now," Whitmore said, his voice low and controlled, though every word carried absolute authority. Calloway hesitated, confusion playing across his face. "Sir," she was resisting. "I said take them off," Whitmore repeated, his voice sharper now, cutting through whatever explanation Calloway had been preparing. The crowd, sensing something significant unfolding, had gone completely silent, phones still raised, watching the chief of police cross the grass with an urgency none of them had expected. Calloway fumbled with the handcuff key, his hands unsteady now, glancing between his chief and the woman he had detained less than 15 minutes earlier. As the cuffs came free, Diane rubbed her wrists gently, her expression calm but unmistakably knowing, watching Whitmore approach with the quiet recognition of someone seeing an old friend arrive exactly when needed. "Chief Foster," Whitmore said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion he made no attempt to hide, "I am so deeply sorry." The crowd's confused murmur rippled instantly into stunned silence. Calloway's face had gone visibly pale, the word chief landing like a verdict he hadn't seen coming. "Officer Calloway," Whitmore said, turning slowly to face the young officer directly. "Do you have any idea who you just handcuffed?" "Sir, Calloway stammered, glancing at Diane with dawning, horrified recognition. "This is Diane Foster," Whitmore said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "She served this department for 32 years. She was this city's first black female police chief, a position she held for 11 years before retiring. She personally trained half the senior officers in this department, myself included." He turned to the internal affairs investigator, who had already begun reviewing footage on her tablet. "Pull Officer Nguyen's body camera. I want the full interaction documented immediately." "I didn't know who she was," Calloway said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "If I had known." "That's exactly the problem," Diane said quietly, stepping forward, her voice calm but carrying an authority that silenced him instantly. "You shouldn't have needed to know who I was. I answered your questions. I showed you identification. I complied with every request you made, and you still decided I deserved to be handcuffed in front of my own neighborhood." The internal affairs investigator looked up from her tablet, her expression grim. "Chief, the footage confirms it. Mrs. Foster remained fully compliant throughout the entire interaction. There's no legal basis for the detention documented here." Captain Roy Hensley, Calloway's uncle, arrived moments later, having been alerted by a concerned officer at the precinct, his face falling as he took in the scene, his nephew standing pale and stammering, the chief of police standing beside a woman he clearly held in enormous respect, and a crowd of neighborhood witnesses who had watched the entire humiliating sequence unfold. "This is a misunderstanding," Hensley tried, stepping forward. "Brett was simply following up on loitering complaints. Complaints that, I'm told, have exclusively targeted elderly black residents of this park for the past 6 months," the internal affairs investigator said flatly, holding up her tablet. "Complaints your office repeatedly closed without proper review." The unraveling that followed happened swiftly, in full view of the gathered crowd. Calloway's face had drained of all color, his earlier authority completely gone, replaced by the visible panic of a man watching every excuse crumble in real time. "I was just doing my job," he said weakly. "Your job is to serve this community," Whitmore said, his voice hard now. "Not to decide, based on nothing but assumption, that a woman feeding pigeons deserved to be handcuffed." Internal Affairs formally placed Calloway on administrative leave on the spot, pending a full investigation into both this incident and the pattern of previous complaints his uncle had quietly buried. Captain Hensley himself was informed he would face separate review for his handling of those earlier reports, his decades of quiet protection finally catching up to him in front of the very department he had spent years shielding his nephew within. A few bystanders who had watched silently at first, unwilling to intervene against an armed officer, now stepped forward to offer Diane words of support, several of them apologizing for not speaking up sooner during the confrontation. The elderly man who had recognized her earlier gently touched her shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have said something louder. I'm sorry, Diane." "You said enough," Diane told him gently. "It matters that you tried." Sarah Nguyen stood quietly to the side, her body camera footage already being flagged as the central piece of evidence in what would become a department-wide review. Her earlier decision to quietly document everything and alert the chief's office finally revealed as the turning point in a morning that could have ended very differently. Justice in that park didn't arrive as shouting or spectacle. It arrived quietly, inevitably, in the form of a chief who remembered exactly who had once believed in him, and a young officer who chose integrity over comfortable silence. 6 months later, Fairview Park looked much the same as it always had. The same old oak trees, the same winding paths, the same gentle gathering of neighbors on quiet mornings. But something important had changed beneath the surface. Officer Calloway was formally terminated following the Internal Affairs investigation, which substantiated a pattern of racially biased stops stretching back over a year. Captain Hensley resigned shortly after, his decades of quiet favoritism finally exposed to a department no longer willing to look away. The department implemented mandatory bias awareness and de-escalation training across every precinct, developed in close consultation with Diane Foster herself, who agreed to return in an advisory capacity despite her retirement, citing a simple, steady conviction. "I spent 32 years trying to build something better. I wasn't about to let one bad morning undo it." Sarah Nguyen was formally commended for her integrity and, within a year, was promoted ahead of schedule, becoming one of the department's youngest training officers, tasked specifically with mentoring new recruits on the values Diane had spent decades instilling. A small plaque now sits beneath the old oak tree in Fairview Park, dedicated quietly by the Neighborhood Association, reading simply, "In honor of Chief Diane Foster, who taught this city that dignity and authority were never meant to be opposites." Diane still visits most mornings, birdseed in hand, sitting on the same bench, watching a neighborhood she has spent her whole life protecting continue to heal. Her husband Marcus's badge still sits beside her own in the small glass case in her hallway. And now, beside both of them, rests a small framed photograph from the plaque's dedication ceremony. Diane surrounded by neighbors, officers, and a young rookie named Sarah, all of them smiling in the early morning light, in the very park where an ordinary Tuesday had once, briefly, gone terribly wrong before becoming something far better than anyone expected. Have you ever witnessed someone treated with suspicion simply because of how they looked, only to learn later how wrong that assumption truly was? What would you have done standing in that crowd? Drop your answer in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of people who are underestimated.